Welcome to our third session of Advanced PortGen. Today we're going to cover prevailing wage compliance. Really exciting stuff. I am Lisa Lagerstrom. I am with Apex Accelerators. We are formerly PTAC, and we are excited to have this opportunity to work with the port on Advanced PortGen. We're going to focus on some of the things that folks really struggle with, and prevailing wage is one of them. And it's a part of government contracting. If you're going to do public works, you have to understand how prevailing wage works and what it takes to get it done. We intend to talk about how to find your correct wages and how that is really important when you're bidding. We are also going to talk about how to submit payroll, certified payroll, and attents and affidavits, big part of it, administrative tools that we're going to share with you, and then how to position your firm to keep compliance with those requirements. So let's go to the next slide, Wendy. And we're going to talk about the session logistics. The presentation was sent to you last night in an email, and there were some support documents as well. This will be recorded and available to you on the port site, and this is the link to get there. Questions. How we're going to handle questions is you will send your questions directly to me, the moderator, Lisa Lagerstrom, and I will compile those and we will have those at the end. So at the end of this session, we are going to have a closing slide and we'll say goodbye to you and then we'll do our questions. All right, and then a break. We're going to have a break midway, 4 o'clock, if we're on track, 4 o'clock. And then just to consider, there are several things that we really do encourage you to participate in. It's our post survey. It's 4 questions. It helps us be better at what we are doing here and how things resonated. It helps us understand that worked or didn't work and how we can improve our programming for you. And then complete the PWIA training if you have not already. And Wendy's going to talk about PWIA if that is something that's a new term for you. So with that being said, I would like to turn this over to Wendy and get started with today's session. Wendy, take it away.
All right, thank you. I'm going to hand off admitting people back to you.
Okay.
Just a quick plug before I get started. So these are the upcoming sessions. Some of the things I'll touch on today. We'll kind of introduce the bonding and insurance and financial consideration as key things to consider when looking to bid on a public works project. So if you want more information on those, I highly recommend the next couple sessions. And then the resource fair in October, of course, where you'll get to meet with subject matter experts and be able to ask all the questions that you don't feel comfortable asking today. All right. So my name is Wendy. I'm with Naylor Construction Consulting. I am one of the co-owners of our consulting firm, and our focus is labor compliance. So today I get the pleasure of talking to all of you about prevailing wage, which is one of my favorite topics. I am that prevailing wage nerd. So my goal today is really just to be able to give you a blueprint to simplify prevailing wage and kind of take out some of the mystery surrounding it. That's why I love this quote: order and simplification are the first steps towards the mastery of a subject. The actual enemy is the unknown. And in interacting with people in this business, I'd say that's very true. It's kind of the unknown of prevailing wage that really kind of scares people off from working on it. And once you start to break it down, it's actually not as terrifying as you might think. So who is Naylor Construction Consulting? So we are a small woman-owned and operated business based here in Washington State. So for all the small businesses here, I know your pain. So we've been operating as compliance consultants for 6 years. We currently manage about $2.7 billion in projects managing the labor compliance piece. So we do work with a mix. We've got work with agencies, owners reps, prime contractors, as well as working with small businesses, helping them navigate prevailing wage. So we kind of span all the areas of public works construction. It's what we do, it's what we love. So we navigate everything from federal, state prevailing wage, PLA agreements, so multiple jurisdictions. So if you have questions at the end of this about any of those things, I am more than happy to chat with you. So today's training agenda, I'm going to break apart kind of the prevailing wage piece with a focus on Washington State prevailing wage. So initially, we're going to look at it kind of from the bid review process. So things that you need to look for as you're reviewing a public works bid. And then we're going to move into looking at what qualifies as covered work, how to look at wage jurisdictions and wage determinations and being able to understand those, how to go about filing intents, affidavits, and any other supporting documentation. And then certified payroll, the who, what, where, when, and why of certified payroll. And then working through project closeout and how to be a responsible contractor. And throughout, you'll get some tips on how to be successful in public works projects. All right, so I'm breaking this presentation into kind of three main pieces. So the bid review process, what to look for during that. And then if you decide you're going to bid on a project, what considerations you need to factor into your proposal process. And then the third is if you are awarded a project, how do you go about being a responsible contractor and getting all of the things done that have to be done aside from the actual work on the physical project. So the first section, bid review. So to bid or not to bid, there's some great sessions on this is like a whole big topic, but that's really kind of what you need to do is determine whether or not that project is a good fit for you and whether you even want to invest the time and effort into bidding. So some of the big obvious things, are you licensed, registered, and appropriately insured? Those are pretty basic first line things that you need to determine. And then the one I want to focus on is, are you prepared for the administrative burden that's associated with public works? And I think this often goes unsaid. So people think of like, okay, well, do I have the manpower to do this work? Do we have the appropriate skills to get the job done? Can we get the materials? But no one really thinks about the administrative burden that comes with working on prevailing wage projects. And it is a substantial requirement, and it is something that you have to factor into your decision on whether or not you want to proceed. And then whether or not you can meet all of the requirements that come with prevailing wage, certified payroll, and documentation. Moving on to your bidding considerations. So what we'll talk about here is if you do decide to bid on a public works project, you need to be able to successfully navigate the requirements in the bid and factor those into your proposal. So really to do that effectively, you need to understand like what your scope of work descriptions are, how those are going to factor into what you have to pay your employees on the project, how to read wage determinations and where to even find those, and then what kind of documentation and or reporting might be required for that project. So those are all things that you're going to consider while you're working on your proposal. And then the last section, responsible contracting. So if you're awarded a project, then what do you have to do to be a responsible contractor and meet all of the requirements that come with that work on the administrative side? So most of you are going to be experts in whatever your respective fields are. So you've got that, you know you can do the work, but keep in mind the administrative piece. Who's going to be responsible for filing all your documentation, for getting your certified payroll submitted? Do you have that capacity? And how to make sure that everything's done on time, which I will mention multiple times. The on time is a critical component of this. So that's kind of what the last section will be. And that's where I'll get into the details on how to file your intents and affidavits, how to go about filing certified payroll, and what those components are. All right, so to talk about prevailing wage, we're going to give you a very, very brief introduction into the history of prevailing wage, a history that is exactly as exciting as it sounds. So it all starts with Davis-Bacon. So Davis-Bacon is a federal law passed in 1931 that requires local prevailing wages be paid on any public works project. It applies to all craft employees, applies to all federally funded projects, but there are also 32 states, including the state of Washington, that have enacted Little Davis-Bacon Acts, aka prevailing wage. So Washington State's prevailing wage is considered a Davis-Bacon related act. And that is work that happens in Washington State that is funded with Washington State dollars. So there is a distinction between federal Davis-Bacon and little Davis-Bacon acts, or your individual state prevailing wage, but they are related. If you want more information on Davis-Bacon, there's a plethora of other opportunities out there. I'll touch on it, but we won't go into detail. So for Washington State's prevailing wage, this was enacted in 1945. And if you go to the Revised Code of Washington 39.12, that contains all of the legal information you will ever want to know for how Washington's prevailing wage works. So it is applied liberally for any projects using state dollars. And the Washington State Department of Labor and Industries, your favorite L&I, is who enforces those laws. So the idea behind this is to create a level playing field and make sure contractors are being paid a fair wage for the work they're doing. One thing to point out, recently the Washington State Supreme Court has changed how they are determining prevailing wage. So the state of Washington used to send out surveys and look at wage rates paid to craft workers kind of across the board, including open shops. Now it's actually being set primarily by what is included in the union CBAs. So that is a change as of October 2022. So that will impact how prevailing wage is determined. So just something to consider as you're looking at wage determinations. Oops, jumped one forward. All right, so Washington L&I, I've given you kind of two sections here. So there's the L&I website, which if you're going to do anything in public works, you're going to want to be familiar with. So within the L&I website, if you go to the public works projects section, it will break down all of the information you need to know. There's also the PWI contractor portal, which is where you log in through My L&I, and that's your individual prevailing wage intent and affidavit portal that allows you to look at your documentation that you need to file with the state of Washington. And that's also where you're going to go to file your certified payroll. So there's two sections of L&I that we're going to be discussing today. There's the general website, and then there's what you'll find in your own portal that you need to set up. All right, so some handy dandy bookmarks. You guys were given the slides ahead of time. So if you click on the links in there, it's going to take you to the different pages. These are some I recommend having bookmarked, just because if you are going to work in this space, you will be visiting them frequently. I will touch on all of these as we move through the presentation, but I just wanted to give you a slide where they're all there kind of consolidated. So prevailing wage law, I'm going to run through the next few slides relatively quick because you know how to read, and you can go in and kind of look at these when you have a little bit more time. But I did want to call out the two main pieces that govern prevailing wage law in the state of Washington. So I mentioned the Revised Code of Washington, RCW 39.12, is the primary source of information on what prevailing wages are to be paid when they come into effect and when they're not required. It also governs surveys and wage determination, so how prevailing wage is determined in the state. It also goes over details specific to apprentices and apprentice registration, intent and affidavit filing, penalties, as well as prohibitions for bidding on future projects. And then kind of accompanying that is the Washington Advisory Code 296-127. And this is going to be more focused on scope of work descriptions for public works. That's also where you're going to find information on usual benefits or fringe benefits and what's allowable, your overtime and double time calculations and payroll requirements, as well as arbitration and violation, how to navigate those if that was to occur. So these are going to be your two main pieces. This is the language for those two. So definitely when you have time, look through this. It's going to define kind of public works. I'm going to touch on this right now, but public works is pretty encompassing. So it really does mean all work, construction, alteration, repair, or improvement other than ordinary maintenance. So maintenance by contract is covered under public work. Ordinary maintenance is not. So be familiar with these two pieces of legal information. That's going to govern everything you need to know about prevailing wage for Washington. All right, so speaking of public works, who are the major players, agencies, and owners in the state of Washington? So if you do work with any of these people, you are likely going to be doing public works projects that require prevailing wage. So Port of Seattle, obviously the sponsor for this workshop, is a big one. WashDOT, Sound Transit, King County, SDOT, any of your public universities, cities, counties, municipalities, any of that work is likely going to fall under public works. And with that is going to come the requirement for prevailing wage. So if you want a nice list here of people to go after looking for work in the prevailing wage space, these are your major players. All right, so I'm going to jump into reviewing a bid. So this is kind of that first section. So if you are looking at a project, you need to decide if it's something you want to bid on, if you want to invest your time. I'm going to focus on kind of the pieces of how to review a bid and making that decision that will benefit you from an administrative standpoint. So when you look at a bid, what should you look for? Again, first things to consider, you have to be properly licensed to do the work. If you don't have the correct licenses, don't even move forward. Do not pass go. So if you are, licensed to do carpentry work and you're trying to bid on a project that requires glass and glazing, you're not going to get any farther. So you definitely want to make sure you have proper licenses. You also need to make sure you're properly registered with the state or federal government, depending on the type of work you're doing. And then, do you have the necessary workers' comp insurance and or bonding that's required for public works? Again, there's sessions on insurance and bonding. Those are separate things. If you need more information on those, you can check out those presentations. But these are kind of the first big things. And so if you are interested in moving forward on a bid, got to make sure these are met. But then the part I want to focus on is, are you actually prepared for public works projects from an administrative standpoint? And one of those things is verifying that your information is current and having completed all of your training in the PWIA portal. So again, that's your My LNI login. It's your individual company portal. And that training is required for you to do any work on public works, because that will require prevailing wage, filing certified payroll, filing an intent. And if you don't have that completed, it doesn't allow you to move forward. So verifying your information and that you have, whether or not you've done this, if you don't know if someone in your company has met this requirement, you can use the Verify a Contractor tool within LNI. So even if you just Google Verify a Contractor, it'll take you to this page, and it allows you to plug in the company's UBI or name, and then it tells you whether or not they're currently licensed, whether or not you've completed the training, if you have your workers' comp current and active. So it's a nice little summary of whether or not you're ready to go. As far as the training, if you have not completed your PWIA training, I highly recommend doing so if you have any interest in public works projects. There are two options for taking the training. It's about a 3-hour course. They do have access online, which you can do on your own pretty much at any time. It's a series of videos. It's pretty straightforward. I would say it's not that complicated. You just have to set aside the hours to sit through some videos. Or if you're more of an in-person kind of individual who really likes that one-on-one, you want to be in the same room as the person talking, you want to be able to ask questions, then I would recommend LNI's contractor training days. So they hold these around the state, and you can go sit in person and sit through the training, be able to ask your questions live. And then once you've gone through that, that satisfies the requirement. So you can go either or. Just make sure that if you want to move forward in public works, that you have completed this training before you start the bid process. So now the administrative burden piece. So when you look at a bid, most people tend to focus on, can we meet the specific requirements for our line of work? So I'm going to focus not on that. I don't know your line of work, and you're probably an expert in that. I'm not. However, what I'm going to try and showcase here is the fact that you do need to also consider what are the other requirements in that bid that impact your administration side of things. So the administrative burden should be factored into your decision on whether or not you want to bid on a project, because that is going to include time demands and costs associated with those that should be factored into the overall decision on whether or not you want to move forward. So when looking at the administrative burden in terms of whether or not you want to bid, my first recommendation is involve all of your internal stakeholders. So I know bigger companies have an entire team that is dedicated just to this. They've usually got that covered. When you're looking at smaller businesses, we're all wearing many hats, but sometimes you have a person who handles your administrative side. Definitely involve them. Have them look through the bid, have them evaluate what hidden labor compliance requirements might be in there that are too often dismissed as not really being important at this stage. Like, oh yeah, we can do it. But if you're having your administrative team look at that bid from their perspective, it'll help give you a better picture of whether or not it's worthwhile to move forward. And then use that feedback from your administrative team and have them evaluate whether or not you have the capacity to take on the requirements. So dealing with certified payroll submissions, all of the prevailing wage documentation, any reporting that might be required, you need to have an idea if your team has the capacity even to move forward on something like that. And if they don't, can you acquire that capacity, whether that's onboarding more personnel, whether that's hiring an outside agency to manage your payroll or part of that scope, but have that in mind as you go through and consider time to train new people and what your contingency plans are if your administrative person leaves in the middle of a project. How are you going to continue to fulfill requirements? So those are things to consider, and it's why I recommend getting your internal stakeholders involved. So when you review a bid, what kind of things should you look for? So looking for any type of labor compliance requirements that are hidden in all the various different pieces of this. So the big one that's usually called out and relatively straightforward is your funding sources and prevailing wage requirements. So it should be clear if you're dealing with state requirements, if there's federal requirements, those can come in the form of just straight Davis-Bacon. They can also come in the form of like different HUD requirements or the Infrastructure Reduction Act or Inflation Reduction Act. Those are now coming with additional reporting requirements that didn't used to be around. So definitely pay attention to those, call them out, piece them out. Additional agreements. So more and more, especially throughout King County in particular, we're seeing more community workforce agreements or project labor agreements. So those are going to start to involve signatory union requirements. So those are definitely good to be aware of. As far as goals and utilization, check to see if there's any language in there that supports, what their DEI goals are for the project. Are there minority business goals? Are there women-owned business goals, veteran-owned business goals, and how you fit into that? Also, whether or not the project is going to require the use of apprentice utilization or local hire requirements, and then consider whether or not you think your company can fulfill those. For certified payroll reporting, pay attention to what software systems are going to be required. So for any Washington state prevailing wage job, it's mandated that you file your certified payroll through Washington L&I. That's across the board. More and more, you're starting to see secondary systems that are required in addition to Washington state L&I. LCP Tracker is the most common one that I encounter. There's also some work that has to be done through like B2G Now that's associated with certified payroll. And there's some smaller, software companies out there that pop up here and there on different projects. If it's federal, you've got the WH347 form for certified payroll. pay attention to whether or not they want electronic submission, if they accept paper records, and whether or not you have things in place to meet whatever their requirements are. And then lastly, document filing. So any prevailing wage job for Washington State will require the filing of an intent and an affidavit. That's absolutely the minimum requirement. There's also additional requirements based on projects. So you could be required to submit daily logs to the prime contractor or the owner. There can also be, different monthly reports, monthly utilization reports that have to be filed, your apprentice utilization reports. It really just depends on what the project specific requirements are. So to assist you in reviewing a bid in the future, I've put together a checklist, and you'll get a copy of this checklist as an attachment after this presentation. But this is just a very basic guide as you're reviewing a bid to start calling out these different pieces so that you have those to factor into your decision on whether or not to move forward. So it's a good tool to use as you're going through that and being able to add that to all of the other things you're having to consider. So in your decision to bid or no bid, if you think you're going to go for it, then that means you have the appropriate licensing and registration, your insurance and bonding requirements are met, it's financially feasible for you to take on the scope of work, you can meet all of the technical requirements that the project requires, and the highlighted piece, the administrative burden can be met with your existing internal resources, your admin team, your payroll teams, or you've already decided to acquire external resources that can assist you with that process. So if you've got all of that on lock, absolutely go for the project, bid on it, and hope for the best. If, however, any of those things are a no, and you are lacking the resources internally, and you don't have the option to go to an external resource to assist with that administrative burden, then I would suggest a no bid. You're not going to be a competitive bidder, but also you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you think you can do all of the things and then you find out you can't. So it's best to wait, build up, and get to the point where you can bid in the future. So that's kind of the first section. Do you want to move forward and even submit a proposal or not? So the next piece of that is, if you meet the requirements and you decide you want to bid on a project, what comes next? And again, I'm going to focus on the administrative piece of this, which I do think is often kind of just dismissed. And it's one of the common things I hear from contractors that I work with, where they're like, I wish I had known these requirements when I bid on this project. Had I known, I wouldn't have done it, or I would have done things differently. So with that comes an understanding of prevailing wage, what the applicable prevailing wage is on the project, understanding scopes of work, and this one's huge. So what scopes of work will be included in that project and how to assign the correct prevailing wage to those, what your certified payroll requirements are and how much time is going to be required to get those submitted, and then who you need to include in your process of putting together your proposal. So to dive into scope of work, so what exactly do we mean when we say scope of work? And I've tried to clarify all the terminology that I use throughout the presentation. Definitely put a question in chat if I use a term that you're not familiar with. I know this industry is absolutely horrible with acronyms. So definitely throw that in chat to Lisa if that's something you want clarified later on. But scope of work is kind of one of those things that gets thrown out there a lot. And what does that really mean? So to determine scope of work, really you have to define what is covered work. So covered work is going to be anything that requires prevailing wage. So if I say that's covered work, that means that work is subject to prevailing wage. And then the scope of work is what defines that. So within the legalese, there's full descriptions of what is included in a given scope. But this is kind of the basic covered work, prevailing wage. and then looking at the scope of work beyond that. So why am I spending so much time talking about covered work and scope of work? So biggest thing, correct classifications must be used on certified payroll and determining prevailing wage, because that's a big part of certified payroll, and misclassification of your workers is illegal. So this is, I think, where most contractors probably go wrong, is they incorrectly classify their employees. Sometimes it's malicious to get a lower wage rate. Sometimes it's just they don't understand what falls under each scope. So I'm going to try and help clarify that, but misclassification of workers is illegal. So you have to know the scope of works that apply to your covered work. So scopes of work can be found in the WAC codes, so 296-127. So this is the language for scope of work descriptions. And then it is broken down by each major trade and then what's included in each of those. So if you ever have questions regarding the scope of work for a specific classification, definitely refer back to the WAC. So I'm going to dive into some commonly misunderstood scopes of work. So if you read through the WAC codes, a lot of those are pretty self-explanatory and you'll be able to easily identify, yes, this is covered work under power equipment operator. But there are a few options that are frequently where things go wrong. These are a lot of the red flags that auditors look for as well. So I wanted to touch on these. So some of the commonly misunderstood scopes of work: trucking and delivery of material. This is a big one. It's also one that changed relatively recently in Washington State's history. Offsite fabrication, another misunderstood area. The use of surveying and surveyors, equipment rental and repair, and then the laborer classification. So trucking and delivery. Why is this one a misunderstood area? So there's some pretty distinct differences within trucking and delivery that defines whether or not your work is covered under prevailing wage or if it's not. So if you're doing mobilization of equipment, so unloading, setup, and movement of equipment to specified areas on a job site, that is considered covered work. If you are delivering non-standard items to the job site, and we're going to touch on non-standard items in more detail, but if it's a non-standard item specifically for a public works project, then delivery of that material is considered covered work. Work that's not covered in terms of trucking and delivery is the simple drop-in delivery of materials, basic materials, standard materials. So if you're dropping off a shipment of basic windows, that is not considered covered work. You don't have to pay that truck driver prevailing wage. So that's considered true drop-in delivery. This does not apply to sand, gravel, asphalt, and concrete delivery. So we'll touch on that as well. But if you are delivering concrete or aggregate material, there's a whole separate determination that covers that. I also wanted to touch on the fact that if you have a truck driver who's delivering supplies, standard material, then he does not require prevailing wage. However, if that truck driver gets out of his truck and unloads material, transports anything on site, or does any other work, then his scope of work changes, and now he might be subject to prevailing wage. So you need to make sure that your employees also understand what they're doing might switch from covered work to not covered work pretty quickly. So you want to be mindful of that. There are always people on job sites who are going out and doing field interviews and watching what's happening in order to check for this very thing. So it's a good thing to be aware of if you have truck drivers going on site and making sure that they're not jumping out of their truck and doing work. If they are, then they need to know that they receive prevailing wage, and you need to know that they receive prevailing wage. So fuel delivery kind of falls under this whole trucking area. It is a little bit of a gray area. And the question is always, what scope of work applies to fuel delivery? Because there is not a specifically called out scope of work determination for this. We have pushed for it. We continue to push for it, but it does create a lot of confusion. So thus far, my recommendations are if it's fuel tank delivery. So if you've got a driver who's bringing in a tank of fuel and that fuel tank is simply delivered to the project site, you drop it off and he leaves, then that is probably just going to fall under truck driving, basic truck driving. Use truck driver classification. I've linked to the WAC description for that specific scope of work. However, if you have fuel truck driven to the project site, the driver hops out and he refuels smaller generators or smaller tanks on site equipment from the main truck, now his scope of work is split. So he went from being a truck driver to now he should be classified as a power equipment operator because he's operating a pump. And I know to some of you that probably sounds ridiculous, but that is the way the state sees it, because you have to be classified based on the work you are performing, not necessarily your title. So keep in mind, if you're in the business of fueling, if you get out of your truck and refuel other equipment, then your scope of work changes from truck driver to power equipment operator. And hopefully they'll make this more clear in the future, but right now that's kind of the best description we have for how that should be classified. So I mentioned concrete and aggregates. There is a specific WAC determination, which is linked up there. And this refers to the delivery of sand, gravel, crushed rock, concrete, asphalt, or any other material that can be integrated into the project site. So for this is now considered covered work and falls under prevailing wage. A few years back, this was viewed differently. It's typically called out now in contracts because it is such a new determination. But I want you to be aware of it, that if you work in this area, plan on this work being covered by prevailing wage. And there's also some specifics there to consider. So travel time is also part of your covered work. So time spent waiting to load, unload, transport, all of that is on the clock as being paid prevailing wage. You also have prevailing wage if you're delivering either on site or adjacent to site. Adjacent to site tricks people. So any stockpile site that is right next to the project site or solely for the use of that project is considered adjacent. Delivery to a true stockpile that could be used for multiple things is not covered. So there are some distinctions there to be familiar with. And then what wage are you paid if you work in this? So the production of these materials is covered work, and that's based on the county where the materials produced. The delivery of said materials is based on the location of the project. So as you're determining what prevailing wage and what county to pull from, you have to separate out the delivery of the material versus the production of the material. All right, offsite fabrication and non-standard items. So this trips up a lot of people. So there are some resources out there to determine whether or not you have a standard versus a non-standard item. So production of standard items, which is generally something that you could buy off of a shelf. It can be used across multiple projects. There's nothing really special about it. It's something that's commonly used. If that item is standard, fabrication of that material is not covered work for the project, so no prevailing wage. However, if you're producing non-standard items, then that does fall under prevailing wage and is considered covered work. And for that, fabrication should be paid at the prevailing wage rate for the county in which the work is being done. So off-site fabrication done at a shop in Tacoma, but the job is located in downtown Seattle, the prevailing wage rate that applies to the workers in shop in Tacoma is for Pierce County. And then transportation and delivery of those items is also considered covered work, but that will be paid at the prevailing wage rate for the county in which the project sits in. So again, it can be kind of confusing to keep track of this, but they are things that you want to look at so you know what prevailing wages are going to apply. And if you have questions on whether or not an item is standard or non-standard, there's a handy checklist that was created. This slide goes through the series of questions that you'll ask, and based on the answer, it's either yes, covered, or you continue on. If you make it all the way through these questions, then chances are it's a non-standard item. You don't have to pay prevailing wage and you're fine. But if you answer yes to any of them, then you're going to have to integrate the fact that prevailing wage applies. You all get the full checklist and the explanation, the determination for this after the class as a handout. So if that's something that you're interested in, you will be receiving some additional information there. Surveying. So this is another area that can be tricky. Generally, surveying work is considered by most to be, incorrectly considered, I should add, to be a professional service because they require specific certifications. And so the professional work exclusion that covers design work, architects, engineers, computer programming is often thought to encompass surveying. Washington State has issued a very specific determination for surveyors. So this happened in the last 5 years that indicates that no, it does not fall under that exclusion. Surveying, because it's done in support of design work and construction, is considered covered work. And there are specific classifications and scope of work descriptions for surveyors. So if you work in surveying or you would need to hire a surveying company, most likely that work is going to be considered covered work and be subject to prevailing wage. Equipment rental and repair. This is another relatively new change to the law. I end up dealing with this one almost every single week because it's still not well known or understood. But knowing when equipment rental, so rental equipment, if that's repaired or maintained on the project site, is that subject to prevailing wage or not? So if we take a scenario where rental code drops and delivers a boom lift as part of its rental agreement onto a project site for a contractor to use. So that equipment is leased, so the rental company performs repairs as needed on site. No additional money is exchanged for the repairs because it's considered part of the original lease agreement. Question is this work covered under prevailing wage? And the answer is, if it's done on site, yes, it is. So if your rental company comes on site and they need to replace a tire, if they do that on the project site, that work is covered under prevailing wage, and that mechanic would have to be paid prevailing wage by the rental company. And that rental company would now need to file an intent and affidavit for the project, file their certified payroll. If, however, they take that piece of equipment offsite, so they come and retrieve it, they take it back to their shop and they work on it there and then bring it back, not covered under prevailing wage. So this is how rental companies, I shouldn't, evade is not necessarily the correct word, but it's how they get out of being subject to prevailing wage, is they simply take the equipment offsite and either replace it with a functional piece of equipment, or then they bring it back after the repairs are done. So the location of the repairs is what matters here. And there is a specific determination. This is relatively new, but this kind of goes into detail on third-party vendors and on-site equipment repair and how that is subject to prevailing wage. And then lastly, and most importantly, the use of the classification general laborer. So this tends to be the catch-all. It's the classification people use when they don't think any other classification fits, or they just want to throw a general classification in there. It is also the most common classification involved in violations for misclassifying workers. And it is one of the key things that every auditor looks for, is if they see a company that only has general laborers on certified payroll, they will immediately flag it and they will dig deeper. So be very careful with using this classification. It's obviously a valid classification, but you have to make sure you're using it correctly and that the scope of work that the employee did cannot be claimed by any other scope of work description. So again, a reminder, classification of your worker is determined by the scope of work they're performing, not by their title not necessarily by their specialty. If you have a power equipment operator who's doing the work of a general laborer, he can be classified as a general laborer. But if you have a general laborer doing the work of a power equipment operator, he now has to be paid the rate for a power equipment operator. So you do have to keep track of hours of work performed under each scope of work if you have someone doing multiple tasks on a job site, because then that dictates what they should be classified on for certified payroll. So a good example of this, a general laborer in King County makes $56.80 an hour. If your general laborer who's just helping with basic moving of material on the job site hops in a forklift and moves material with the forklift for an hour, because he's operating a forklift, he now falls under a power equipment operator forklift, and that wage rate is $75.35 an hour. So huge discrepancy here in what he should be paid, which is why you have to keep track of what their actual scope of work is. Because if they, let's say someone snaps a photo, shows your guy in the forklift operating it, then if they cross-check that with payroll and he's only classified as a general laborer, then they are going to slap you with a fine for misclassifying your worker. So when in doubt on how a worker should be classified, if you just can't seem to find a scope of work description that fits, before you just default to this, always ask L&I for clarification. They are the ultimate authority in determining how a worker should be classified. So if there's any doubt in your mind, that's who you should go to. Provide them with all the information, what tools they're using, what they're actually doing on the job site, and L&I will be able to help issue you a correct scope of work determination. So that covers scope of work, all exciting stuff. So why is all of that so important? Why is understanding, those common pitfalls important? The main reason is because you need the scope of work to decide what that worker should be receiving as pay. And in this bid proposal process, you actually want to know what the prevailing wage rates are. So moving forward, what is the prevailing wage? So this is simply the average wage paid for each trade in each county, dictated by the state. So prevailing wage updates in Washington state every 6 months, and it's determined by the industrial statistician. And when you are looking at defining what the effective prevailing wage date is on a project, you need to look at the contract type. So for most project types, they're going to use the bid due date, because if you're submitting a bid, the date it's due, you're basing your information in your proposal off of that bid due date. So that's why you'll see that as the typical effective date for prevailing wage. However, it will sometimes use the award date if the project is awarded 6 months after the bid due date. So keep an eye on that. That's usually a problem on bigger projects that are design build. Design build also by default uses the award date and not the bid due date. And then job order contracts will typically use the issue date of the work order. So all things to look for. Unit price contracts will typically set it by contract year, and then that prevailing wage applies for the duration of the rest of the year, and then each year it updates with whatever the current prevailing wage rate is. So understand effective dates and know how to pull the correct prevailing wage. So where do you even find prevailing wages? So for Washington state prevailing wages, you'll go to lni.wa.gov. I've linked here to the exact page where you go. So you're going to first select your county, and this is the county for where the work's being done. Then you'll select your trade, put in your effective date right here, and then click Get Wages. And that's going to pull up any classification that falls under that trade, and it will show you what the prevailing wage rate is. So with this, one thing to keep in mind, this section shows you journey rates. However, we also have apprentice wage rates, and they have their own wage determination tables. So if you need to look up an apprentice wage, then you'll click on that link to take you to the apprentice wages. And then you'll do a similar task where you're going to pull the county, your trade, your effective date. But now it's going to show you the different step levels for your apprentice. and their apprentice wage rate. So apprentice wages are always based on a percentage of the journey prevailing wage rate for that same trade. So why so much focus on apprentices? So apprentices are the only time you can pay less than the journey prevailing wage rate on a public works project. But to enforce that this isn't misused in any way, there are restrictions on who can be defined as an apprentice. So apprentices are defined as those workers for whom an apprenticeship agreement has been registered and approved by the state. So they have to be a registered apprentice in a state-approved program to be considered an apprentice, a registered apprentice that gets to qualify for those prevailing wage rates. So you can go to the L&I Arts database, which is the apprenticeship registration and tracking system. There's the link. And it'll pull you to two different options. So you can search for an apprenticeship program, or you can search for an apprentice. So depending on what you're trying to find, if you want information on a program, what their specifications are, then you can search by that. You can use location, training agent, or even employer. And that'll pull like the JATC guide for that apprenticeship program. If you want to see if an apprentice is registered, you can search by name, or their apprentice ID is a number issued to them if they are correctly registered. And once you plug that in, it'll actually take you to their information, and you'll be able to identify if they're currently registered and what their step level is. So that's looking up state prevailing wage. If a project also requires federal, or if you're looking at strictly federal, you're going to go to sam.gov to find your wage determinations. And it's very similar. You're going to pull your state, the county, the construction type. So federal's going to be slightly different in that regard, whether you're dealing with heavy building. But you'll plug that information in, and then you're going to get your federal wage determination. The other agreement that might take place is if a project falls under a PLA or CWA agreement, now you have signatory union requirements. So with that, you would need to have access to the signatory union rate sheets, or their Schedule A's. So if you decide to work on a project that falls under a PLA, then you need to have access to the signatory union. You're going to get assigned a union based on your scope of work, and then you'll get issued one of these sheets. So one of the things to keep in mind on PLA or CWA agreements is the rates don't always lock in like a standard prevailing wage job, where you assign that effective date and that's the rate that applies for the duration of the project. Some of the PLAs in the region, especially Sound Transit's PLA, enforce the updated, like the most current wage rate is what has to be paid for the duration of the project. So there's no lock-in date. So wages are always changing on the project in terms of what's required. So one thing to point out with union wages that gets a lot of people into trouble is the differentiation on these sheets between what is an employee payroll deduction and what an employer contribution is. So a contribution is a fringe benefit the employer pays into a third-party fund that benefits the employee. The deductions are things deducted from the employee's pay, so union dues, things of that nature. So those are treated very differently. So make sure you're separating those out if you find yourself looking at union rate sheets. So I pointed out those employer contributions, which involve usual benefits or fringe benefits. So they go by both names. Something to pay attention to. So fringe benefits are employer paid contributions, and they have to be a valid program in order to be utilized and factored into your prevailing wage rate. So employer paid contributions, health insurance, pension funds, vacation, apprenticeship training program fees, those are all valid. So if you want more information, there's a couple links to resources here on what constitutes an allowable fringe. You do have to make sure that those are allowable before you can include them on your payroll as part of a prevailing wage rate. Just a quick note on fringes, Washington State does not recognize cash fringe. So if you say, well, I'm giving $2 an hour to the employee to be used towards their health expenses, that is not a fringe benefit. fringe benefit has to be paid to a third-party administered fund. So if you're paying cash fringe, it's basically part of their base rate of pay. That's how it's treated. And that's important because it has tax implications, as well as overtime, double time calculation implications, which is really the area that dings most people. So no cash fringe is allowed in Washington state. You either add it to their base rate of pay, or it has to be a bona fide fringe that goes to a third party. So understanding what the prevailed rate is, since we've mentioned there's base rate of pay and there's fringes. So the total rate for Washington state does not specify a specific fringe package or a fringe rate that has to be met. It is driven by the total amount paid to the employee, or what we refer to as the base rate of pay. That's the predominant form of pay that the employee receives. But the state does recognize that you can include allowable fringe benefits as part of the employee's total pay package. So the total rate is going to be the base rate of pay that the employee receives on their check, plus allowable fringe benefits. So if you add those two together, that's your total rate. That's what the state prevailing wage rate needs to meet. So an example of that is the prevailing wage rate for glazers is $75.91 an hour. So if your employee receives a base rate of pay of $54.45 an hour and $21.46 in bona fide fringes, then prevailing wage has been met, because that adds up to the $75.91. And that's typically what you're going to see with unions. They have bona fide fringes, and so you're always looking at the combination. If you're an open shop, you would just pay, you don't pay any bona fide fringes, you just pay the employee straight $75.91 an hour. Prevailing wage has also been met. So you can factor fringe benefits into the prevailing wage rate and use that to decrease the base rate of pay, but you have to make sure that they're allowable before you do that. Couple other things to consider when you're looking at the prevailing wage rate and how to factor this into your bid proposal process. Overtime and double time, if it's anticipated that you're going to have to work any overtime or double time, know the rules. And these are trade specific. So WAC 296-127-022 defines the absolute minimum standard, but every trade has their specific overtime codes, which can be a lot stricter than that WAC reference. So with overtime and double time, know when it kicks in for the trades that you're going to be dealing with, and then understand any nuances there. So one of the common misconceptions between state prevailing wage and Davis-Bacon is that Davis-Bacon is very simple. Anything over 40 hours in a week triggers overtime. In Washington state, almost every single trade has language, which I've highlighted here, which is any hours worked in excess of 8 hours a day or 40 hours a week has to be paid at overtime. So people coming from the private sector or federal jobs think anything over 40 a week triggers overtime. But if you have a guy who works 8.5 hours on Monday and then 7.5 hours on Tuesday and then 8s the rest of the time, they're like, oh, well, you know, he only worked a 40-hour week. It's fine. We don't have to pay overtime. Except Monday he worked 8.5. So that 0.5 hours is subject to overtime because it was over 8 in a day. So you have to be very careful with that. Some trades also specify hours. So like this one, any hours worked outside of 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. would trigger overtime. And again, every trade is different. They all have specific requirements. It also applies to when double time kicks in. So for most trades, it's anything over 12 hours in a day triggers double time. But electricians, it's over 10 hours in a day. So you just need to know what trades you're working with and pay really close attention to these overtime codes, which are in that L&I wage determination table, and then make sure you know what applies to your people. Another thing to think of with overtime, double time is any type of shift premium pay or zone pay. So within, mostly this is on union projects, but a lot of the unions have a clause that triggers an additional $1.50 an hour zone pay requirement if they're working in the downtown Seattle corridor, and they define what that is. So if you do have a project where an employee is working in downtown Seattle, they receive an additional $1.50 an hour. It's a flat rate, so it doesn't matter whether they're working regular hours or overtime hours. It's paid directly to the employee. It is not a fringe benefit. It is considered basically part of their base rate of pay. So any flat rate is going to go and be considered part of their regular rate of pay, which is used to calculate overtime. So if they are receiving that premium, then that additional $1.50 needs to be included in your overtime calculations. So anything that's not a bona fide fringe benefit is considered part of their base wage and regular rate of pay, and that should be compounded into overtime. So this also applies to shift premiums. So like if you have a shift premium for working the graveyard shift, sometimes there's like foreman premiums. Those are also considered flat rate additions that have to be compounded into overtime. So this slide has got some overtime practice on how to calculate this. I'm gonna pull these up just so you can see them. A few different examples. I don't want to spend too much time on them just because we have a lot to cover today, but you can see some different examples of combinations of like a base rate with fringes and a foreman premium, and then what the base rate of pay should be, what your overtime and double time rates are. So it's a good series of examples that you can kind of look through to see how to calculate overtime and factor that into the rates you're going to owe your employees. So some other quick considerations. If you've got owner operator, so if you're an owner operator, you are exempt from paying yourself prevailing wage. However, you still have other requirements you have to meet. So you still have to file your intent and affidavit, and you have to file certified payroll. And you're just going to check the box, I'm an owner operator, and you don't have to put how much money you paid yourself. So there's still some requirements, but not the prevailing wage piece. Supervisors and foremen are another kind of odd consideration. So if you have a supervisor or foreman on the project site, whether or not they're subject to prevailing wage depends on what work they're doing. So if they're strictly supervising, they never pick up a tool, or less than 20% of their time is spent working, actually using a tool or putting work in place. They are not subject to prevailing wage, with the idea that those people are usually salaried and they're going to be above prevailing wage anyway. If those foremen or supervisors spend more than 20% of their time, but less than 50% doing hands-on work, then they're owed prevailing wage for just the hours that they worked, not the supervising hours, just the hours where they were actually putting work in place. If they work more than 50% of their time on the project site that week, then they're subject to prevailing wage for all hours worked that week, including their supervisory time. So you do have to keep track of supervisors and foremen and how much time they're actually spending doing work on the site versus strictly supervising. So some estimating considerations. This is just kind of a very brief overview of things to consider in your direct costs when you're putting together your proposal. Field labor costs is basically everything I've just touched on. So understanding what scopes of work apply, what their prevailing wage is, what their overtime, double time requirements might be, who's subject to prevailing wage, and making sure you're building that into your proposal and encompassing everything that you would have to pay out for field labor. You've got, your materials, equipment, professional service fees. So if you had to pay like an engineer or an architect firm to do something, that's what that would fall under. Your intent and affidavit filing fees, it does cost money to file those through the state. And then if there are any software requirements for the project, if you have to use something like a Texture or Procore, sometimes there's a fee associated with those. You'd want to factor that in as well. And then the other things to consider is indirect costs, which is basically your administrative burden. So what type of staffing you're going to have or external support that you're going to have to pay for to manage all the certified payroll, filing all of that, filing documents, the amount of time that takes. You have to pay someone to do it. Or if you're super small, you're going to be doing it, but you need to make sure you're getting paid to do that work as well. So a lot of that are things that people don't really consider, but it eats up a significant amount of time. So you want to build that into kind of your unit pricing. So in your unit pricing, it usually has language similar to this, which is contractors should allocate any overhead, insurance, fees, profit, project costs into their unit price. So all of your costs should be integrated into your unit prices in your bid proposal. So make sure that you are allocating some portion of that for the administrative burden of these projects. It's hard to kind of know what that is until you started doing the work, but it is important to factor it in. The number of times I have gotten feedback from small contractors saying, if I had known I had to do all of this, I would have never worked in public works because I'm losing money. The reality is that wouldn't have to be the case. You can be extremely successful as long as you consider this ahead of time and build that into your proposal so that you are getting paid for that and you're not losing money. So for estimating, things to keep in mind from the administrative side. So know how to determine your field labor correctly. This gets a lot of people into trouble because they underbid, not realizing what the prevailing wage requirements are. Your administrative labor, build that into your overhead, as well as any fees that you might have to pay to do that scope of work. So definitely consider that in your estimating. In this process, involve all your stakeholders within your business. Get everyone's opinion. It's important. Everyone has a different perspective and might pull out a different thing that you need to include. Review and verify all of your wage compliance requirements. All right, now on to my favorite section. So we kind of left off at how to prepare yourself to bid, the information you need to know. You've been awarded a contract, hooray. Now the real work begins. So this is really where all of your pre-work will pay off if you have done that pre-work. And this section will focus mostly on the actual requirements and how to go about filing the required documentation and your certified payroll. So I'm sure this is probably what most of you are here for. So we'll dive in. So there are a few things that you're going to have to do before your actual field work starts. So a lot of people, I think, they don't really think about anything that they need to do until they set foot on site and actually start putting work on place. But before that happens, you do have quite a bit of work on the administrative side that needs to happen. With all of this, communication is key. I can't emphasize this enough. You need to be communicating with the owner or the agency. You need to communicate with L&I. You might need to communicate with a prime contractor, depending on what your role is. Just make sure that you are continuing these conversations, checking in to see if they need anything from you, getting information to the correct people on your own team, so that you're meeting all these requirements in a timely manner. So one of the first is who's handling certified payroll. Whether you have a person on your own team or if you're a really small company and it's you, if you're hiring someone externally to manage your certified payroll for you, whatever the case is, get that person and get them all of the relevant contract details before work starts. So they need to know what the project requirements are, what the prevailing wage rates are, what information, what documentation they're going to have to submit before they actually do the work. And I would say probably 80% of the people I work with get this wrong. So the people who are doing the estimating and the project managers or the owners, they have this information and they just assume that whoever's handling certified payroll can just jump right in and like magically know all these things. And that's not the case. And so then the person submitting payroll is getting everything rejected because they didn't know the requirements. It never got to them. So again, communication, especially with your own team, is really important. Establish who the prevailing wage administrator is for either the agency or the prime, depending on your situation. Make them your best friend. If you have questions about paperwork documentation, know who that person is, know who you can go to. And then establish a communication channel and workflow to ensure that everyone on the project is aware of the project requirements. So on the certified payroll front, on the administration front for, filing documentation, make sure your employees and your PMs and supervisors know that this is a prevailing wage job and that they're going to have to track their hours differently. It's amazing how many times people are working on a project and they didn't even know it was prevailing wage. So just make sure that you've got that communication channel going out to everyone, because the process will be much smoother if they all know what to expect. And then any required paperwork that has to be done before your start date, you will make your owner or your prime contractor so happy if you actually get this done before work starts. So pay attention to those required dates, required forms, and get them done. So required postings, you have to have an approved copy of the intent to pay prevailing wage, and this needs to be posted on the project site. So if you're the prime contractor, have it posted. If you're a subcontractor, post it in your job trailer, wherever you need to post it. If there isn't an actual physical site, then it has to be in a place where employees can work, or even sometimes it can be like a virtual, meeting area where they can go pull documentation. But you have to have this listed and available to people so that they can see what the project requirements are from that perspective. So make sure if you are the prime contractor that you understand this requirement and have your prime intent out there. And as a sub, you need to have it available to your people. So intents and affidavits. These are the basic forms that Washington State requires for work on any public works project. So an intent is simply a form that states your intent to pay prevailing wage on that project. So all requirements flow down from the prime intent to everyone below them. So the prime contractor should have this filed as soon as the public works project is awarded. So the moment you have that information, you should be getting your prime intent filed, because everyone underneath you has to refer back to that document. If you're filing as a subcontractor, you'll have to reference the prime contractor intent number. So make sure that you have that. It'll be in your contract documents, but you're going to need that number when you go to file your own. And all intent and effective date information flows down from that prime intent or the general contractor's intent to everyone underneath them. So that's why it's such an important document. So the intent's filed before work starts. The affidavit is the corresponding document, so they're linked. And it's the document that basically states it's an affidavit of the wages that you paid on the project. So the intent, you don't necessarily have to know every single scope of work description that you're going to use, and you don't always for big projects, but you're going to list the ones that you think you're going to use. The affidavit has to be an exact representation of every scope of work trade that you used on the project, what they were paid, how many hours they worked. That has to match certified payroll. And it's also going to be where you track any lower tiers that you may have hired on the project. So both of these documents are filed in your L&I portal. So who files these? Again, anyone who's working on a public works project has to file them. If you put any work in place, you have to file these. If you're a supplier of materials that get integrated in the project, so going back to our sand, gravel, concrete, have to file them. If you're a consultant who hires a contractor as a sub, you now have to file an intent, because you have to be able to claim a contractor below you that is doing work. Any general contractor who's hiring anyone underneath them have to file. So even if you are not going to perform any work on the project, so let's say you're a big company that manufactures kitchen equipment, you have no one on site, but you're hiring a smaller contractor to perform the installation. Because you're going to have to claim them, you now as a supplier have to file an intent. You're going to claim that you're not doing any field work, but you still have to file these documents so that your lower tiers can file under you. And the reason for that is within L&I, all of these are connected, and they're all going to flow up to the prime intent. So each of these is linked. They have their own unique identification number, and it's a way for the prime contractor, the agency, whoever's involved in compliance, L&I, to be able to view like the project tree and who all's working. So this is the only way that you can link people to a project. And it's also going to be how your certified payroll is linked to the project as well. So you can go to L&I's site publicly and search for any approved intent and affidavit on a project. So you can search by an intent number if you know it, or the affidavit number. Some projects use a combined form, so the two are filed at the same time. You can add all of these search parameters. So if you're looking for every intent filed on a particular project, put in the project name and it's going to pull everyone who's filed a document for that. So this is a good way to kind of look and see who's done work on a project, especially at the higher level. So if you're planning on hiring subs, this is how you help keep track of everyone. From my perspective as a compliance consultant, it's what I monitor to make sure everyone on the project is filing what they need to file. So to file an intent, you're going to log into your My LNI account or your PWIA portal. You're going to navigate to the Prevailing Wage dashboard, and then there's an option to file a new intent. You have two options. You can file as the prime contractor, or you can file as a subcontractor. Completely different requirements as far as what information you have to fulfill and know what you need to be filing as. If you're not a prime, you should not be filing a prime intent. It's $40 fee for each filing. So if you screw up and it's your fault, then you have to pay an additional $40 to file a new document. So you do want to make sure that this gets filed correctly. So do not forget the step where you review everything, cross-check it against what your contract says before you submit and pay. I'm going to give you guys checklists for each scenario. So whether you're filing as a prime or filing as a sub, so you'll have access to those that basically lists every single detail you're going to need to be able to file those documents. So if you're not the one filing, but you need to hand it off to someone, fill out that checklist, give it to the person who's going to do the filing, and you're going to make their day because that'll make the process so much easier. As an example of a completed intent, one of your handouts is an intent that was filed for the Port of Seattle for a project. This was a project for glass and glazing. We were going to use it as kind of a theme in this class, but it didn't work out that way. But this is just an example of an intent that's been filled out and completed and submitted. So this is public knowledge. I had to kind of chop it up on the screen, but you guys have the attachment. So it's going to list everything about your company, who the prime contractor is, who the agency is. It has your effective date for prevailing wage and the description of the project, the contract type, and then it lists whether or not you're planning on hiring subcontractors or will you use apprentices, and all of that factors into reporting requirements for a project. So if you want to look through and see an example of a completed intent, feel free to refer to that one. So the intent and affidavit, key documents, have to be filed up front. Who's required to pay prevailing wage? We've already touched on this, but linking it back to the intent, any individual or contractor who is required to file an intent generally must pay prevailing wage for any work they do on the project. And again, this is the minimum requirement for any public works project. So there can always be additional agreements in place. So don't always think that this is all I have to do. Every project is different. Every project might have additional requirements hidden in there, which is why you need to pay so much attention up front so that you know what to do. But if you're filing an intent, you're going to be subject to prevailing wage. So additional supporting documents that you might have to deal with or encounter on public works projects. These will vary by project. They're not always required, but I wanted to give you a quick overview. So authorization to sign certified payroll. This is also, I think it's the HUD 5282 form on federal HUD projects. It's basically a brief statement authorizing the person in your company who's going to be certifying payroll for you. So it's just a way to verify that the person signing off on your information is authorized to do so, because that person's name is on the statement of compliance on a certified payroll record. And if something goes wrong, that's the person they're going to go to. So you want to make sure that that person has been authorized by the company to sign off on those. 410 agreements. If you're planning on working a 410 schedule, so instead of 5/8, you're going to work 410s, you have to have a separate agreement in place. And that's because of that overtime requirement. So if it's over 8 hours a day, then that triggers overtime, unless you have an appropriate 410 agreement in place, in which case it would be anything over 10 hours a day. So there's a form which is included in your attachments after the class that the state uses, that's a project specific form. So each employee has to sign into that agreement voluntarily with their employer, so that the state knows, okay, they worked 9.5 hours, they were on a 410 agreement, they're not subject to overtime. If you're a union shop, this is usually outlined in the union CBA. There's a section on what type of shift work is allowable, and that union CBA language can serve as your 410 documentation for the project. Another thing that you'll encounter if you plan on using any apprentices is you have to have a copy of that apprentice's arts certificate. So they can be paid a lower rate than the prevailed rate for the craft, but they have to be paid at the prevailed rate for the apprentice in that craft. And in order to do so, you have to have proof that you're a registered apprentice. So I went through how to track that in the arts system earlier. But you're going to pull that certificate, and almost all projects require that you provide that documentation if you're going to have an apprentice on certified payroll. Another thing to note, look at the JATC guides for your specific trades, but if you do have apprentices, almost every trade has language that the apprentice must have one-on-one supervision from a journey worker of the same craft. So if you have an apprentice working with no supervision from a journey worker, they cannot be paid as an apprentice. You would have to pay that apprentice as a journey worker because they're not properly supervised. So there are some things there that you have to keep in mind when you're using an apprentice. This is an example of an apprentice arts certificate. So it's going to show their unique apprentice ID. It'll have their name. Obviously, that's not real. This is going to be their apprenticeship program. So the one that they're enrolled in and registered in. This will show whether or not they're currently active and what their registration date was. So they have to be registered and active prior to the date they're going to perform work. So if you're like, oh man, I had this apprentice, he worked last week, but he wasn't registered, so I'm going to register him this week. Doesn't matter. He wasn't registered at the time work was done. So last week he has to be paid as a journey worker. Now, if he gets approved in the program, moving forward, you can pay him at his appropriate step level. So registered date, and then this is a list of their step levels and the dates in which they increase, and then the percent of journey pay that they can receive. So you'll always want to make sure that you track when they step up, because then that triggers an increased wage rate that's going to apply to those apprentices. All right, so enrollment forms, if a project requires a separate software system for submitting electronic certified payroll, such as LCP Tracker, you're usually going to have some form of like enrollment documentation that's going to be required. B2G Now often is linked to LCP Tracker, and so you'll have some type of enrollment there. Look for those in your contract documents and make sure that you're getting those submitted so that you can be enrolled prior to your start date. Emphasis on prior to your start date. That helps out everyone on the project teams across the board. So don't be that person who waits 3 months into the job and then be like, oh, here's my enrollment form. Because then you're going to have to backtrack as well and get a bunch of document in a very short period of time. Employee consent for wage deductions. There's various templates. This is an example. This is common on state projects and federal projects. Any type of deduction from employee pay has to be tracked and shown to be valid, allowable, and authorized. So typically they're going to require some type of document, like a consent form, that indicates that the employee understands and approves that deduction from their pay. Now, obviously, if there's something like a court order, child support, or garnishment, they don't really have to give you authorization. It's going to happen anyway. So there are a couple exceptions there where you still have to provide documentation, but you don't necessarily have to get the employee's consent. So there are resources in the RCW and the WAC codes that go into allowable deductions, things like taxes, workers' comp, Medicare. Those are allowable deductions. They're state mandated. You can do that. So like your paid family medical leave. Court ordered, obviously, you have to adhere to the court order. Any opted in insurance programs. So if they want to enroll in a medical program, AFLAC, accidental death and dismemberment, whatever that is, then there's going to be some form of document showing they enrolled in that program. Keep that documentation. The big ones, if you do any type of cash advance, personal loan, equipment purchase, I've seen renting an employer-owned property on payroll deductions. Those are allowable, but you have to have an agreement in writing on file. And that has to be presented usually to the agency or the prime as validation that that's a legitimate deduction. Things that you can't do is like theft of material. There are some examples here. There are certain things that can only be included on their final paycheck. And then there are those that are unallowable during ongoing employment. So you cannot deduct from an employee's pay for theft or unpaid bills. It's not allowable. Any damage or loss of company equipment, sorry, but you also can't deduct that from their pay. So the reason for these and the reason for the additional documentation is that basically deducting from an employee's pay and fabricating deductions has been a common form of prevailing wage fraud. So the reason that the documentation is usually requested for these is just to show that this is a deduction in benefit of the employee. So like if they're allowed to buy tools at a discount through the company, great, have it in writing, document it. That benefits the employee. It's an allowable deduction. So the biggest thing there is a lot of people don't understand they need to have this documentation at all. And so they never do, and they have a verbal agreement. But for prevailing wage, it has to be in writing. All right, so that's all your pre-work. So now we're going to dive into filing certified payroll, what you need to know, how to even approach certified payroll. So what exactly is certified payroll? It's simply your payroll data that has a special certification showing what you have paid the employees who worked on a specific prevailing wage job. So CPR records must show your workers' classification, the hours they worked at that classification, the base rate they were paid, any fringe rates, and employee deductions. All of that has to be included. So this data comes from your regular payroll. It should be an exact match of what's on your payroll. And then it's the statement of compliance at the end that's the certification component. So that's all it is. It's basically your payroll records, but it has to kind of be disaggregated and presented in a form that shows just the work done on the public works project. So the who, what, where, when, and why of certified payroll. So what has to be included? Who? It's anyone who performed covered work on the project. So on-site labor, qualifying off-site labor, so like non-standard fabrication in a shop off-site, that would be included. You have to make sure you've got any apprentice supervision. So if you have a non-working foreman who didn't perform any work, traditionally they wouldn't be included on certified payroll. But if that's the only journey level worker you had on site with your apprentice, you need to show them so that it's showing that the apprentice was supervised. Owners and operators, you have to show certified payroll for them. You don't have to show rate of pay. And then just general foremen, again, they need to be on there if they're doing work. You need to show what kind of work was performed. So this is your scope of work, the craft classification that you're choosing. And then for apprentices, you have to have their appropriate step level. The where keys here are where was the work performed, because that pulls in the location prevailing wage part of the requirement. So you need county and state. When was the work performed? All right, so what day of the week? There are times even time of the day needs to be represented, because if there's special requirements for when overtime kicks in after hours or shift premiums, holidays, that triggers different pay rates. So you do need to track when the work is done, not just by day, but even by time of day. And why? Why do you have to do this? Everyone wants to know, why do I have to submit certified payroll? So these records are necessary to provide documentation that supports that workers are being paid the fair wage and that all prevailing wage laws are satisfied. So it's really the only way that GCs, agencies can verify that public funds are being used as they were designated to be. So that's why you have to submit certified payroll. So for submission and submission requirements, this all falls under RCW 3912. It's also included in ESSB 5035, which has been rolled into that revised code. And this is all payroll must be filed with LNI for any public works job. You have to keep all payroll records for at least 3 years from the date of acceptance of a project. These reports need to be submitted monthly during the duration of a project to LNI. Minimum monthly, that's a state requirement. Any federal project and most projects that require like LSP tracker are going to require weekly submission. So make sure you understand the time difference, whether it's LNI or another database, and what the submission frequency needs to be. And then know what has to be contained in a certified payroll record. So before you get started, pre-work is getting your employee databases set up. So in your certified payroll system, there's usually a spot where you can pull in all the employees that you're going to use. LNI there is, so you're going to have to add each employee that you plan to use on the project into that database, put in their craft classification, their wage rates, get them all set up. Same with the database like LSP tracker. So before work starts, I highly encourage you to do the setup, get everyone in so that when you actually go to fulfill your certified payroll weekly submission requirement, that all that work's done and you're not trying to like scramble and get this done at the last minute as well. So filing your certified payroll in LNI is where I'm going to focus. LSP tracker would be an entire other session because it's a different beast and it has its own requirements. But basic requirements for Washington State prevailing wage is that you have to file within LNI. So this is in your PWIA portal. There's 2 options when you go to submit your certified payroll. You can submit manually. So if you come in here, you're going to enter your payroll online. You can also submit it through the form of an XML file. So this can either come from your payroll software system, if it's one that integrates with LNI, or it could come from another software system that's used for certified payroll like LSP tracker. So those are your 2 ways to pull the data in. Down below, you'll also see here are all these links that take you to videos that teach you how to file your certified payroll. So if you're a visual person and you really want to see the process, the videos they're dry and dreadful. There's no getting around it, but they actually do a really good job of walking you through each of the fields and how to actually step by step do your payroll. So those resources are there. It's in your PWIA portal. I've also included an attachment to the handout notes that Lisa sent out last night. That's your PWIA kind of quick start guide. There's also material in there. It's not the visual step by step, but it will give you the information on how to approach this. So you've got those 2 resources. So when you click on that option, the first thing it's going to want to know is, what is your week ending date? You have to assign this at the very beginning, and you have to assign it correctly because you cannot change what your weekend date is in the duration of a project. If you do, they will make you file an entirely new intent and then file anything after that point under that new intent and then close out the old intent. So you're going to have duplicate documents. I just did this for a contractor because they decided to go in and change what their weekend date was in their payroll system. That triggers a whole new set of problems. So it's ideal not to do that in the middle of a project. Next, you're going to identify whether or not you performed work. Yes means you're going to have to go in, plug in your employees and their information. Every prevailing wage job also requires that you submit a no work statement. So if you didn't do any work on a job for a week, you still have to file a no work payroll record that shows that you're not claiming anyone. So get those in, identify your weekend date, whether or not work was performed. If work's performed, then you're going to go in and you're going to input your employees. So if you look up here, you can add a new employee, add them from scratch, or you can choose your existing employees. So if you set up your database ahead of time, you just pop in here, click on all the employees who worked that week, and then it's going to list them all down below. If you need to manually enter someone, you'll have to add them and then select them from the list. And then for each employee, you're going to have to input whether they're an apprentice or not, what their trade was, what their classification was, and their wage information. So fringe benefits, base rates of pay. So plug all that in. And then next you're going to enter their hours. So this is hours for this project only. So it's not their entire payroll period. You're only submitting for the specific project that you're filing certified payroll for. Make sure that you're breaking out your standard time versus overtime or double time. Verify that your wage rate meets prevailing wage. Enter their payroll information from their pay stub. And then double check that all that matches. So here's an example of a partially filled out. So we've got our worker, here's their trade. It's going to locate the county. So like regular time, 8 hours. He worked 4 hours of overtime, at which point he's at 12 hours. So that triggers double time. So then the next 2 hours are at the double time. Correct rates of pay. Gross payroll for the pay period. All the taxes and the deductions are listed out. Here's his fringe benefits. All right, so all that information is there. And then you're going to move to the statement of compliance. And this is something that everyone ignores, but it's the legal part that as the person certifying payroll is going to hold you accountable for the information that you just submitted. So you want to make sure that information is correct and that you're not violating any prevailing wage laws because your name is now tied to this certified record. So make sure everything to the best of your knowledge is correct. And then go ahead and sign that. And this is what makes it a certified payroll record, is this step. So the difference between payroll and certified payroll, I want to touch on this distinction. So regular payroll includes all the hours an employee worked across any project for that week, subject to, payroll taxes and all the normal things. Certified payroll is going to be focused on a specific public works project. And so there are going to be distinctions between those two that you need to account for and think of ahead of time. So making sure that your field team is tracking hours per project. So you have to know, okay, I worked 8 hours on this prevailing wage project on Monday, but then on Wednesday, I worked 8 hours on a different prevailing wage project. You have to be tracking those on your time cards so that the person submitting certified payroll knows what hours go to what project, what's subject to prevailing wage, what's not. Make sure you know which employees are going to be receiving prevailing wage and need to be reported on payroll. Usually people have an idea of who they're going to use on those projects so that they can be updated ahead of time. And then make sure you're tracking hours at different rates of pay and even different scopes of work. So if a guy changes from a general laborer to a power equipment operator, make sure you have those hours distinguished for your administrative team. And then things like foremen and supervisors, different requirements if they're on prevailing wage, or if they're on a private job. So you have to consider that. So all those things are different. Overtime requirements and rates of pay vary from private to public and to union. So you need to have the systems in place to track that appropriately. And then if a mistake is discovered, it's not the end of the world. You're not going to jail. You can make an amendment. You can amend your certified payroll. It happens all the time. So as long as you're catching it and you're doing everything in good faith, you'll be fine. So an amendment shows an update to your payroll record. So an update to the hours worked if maybe they got missed on a time card. Or you realized, oh crap, we paid this guy for a private job, but he was actually on public works. We need to pay him prevailing wage. You just issue restitution pay. Make him whole, the term they use, and then add that information to the payroll record and you're fine. So just note those changes. It tracks the changes in LNI system so you can see each individual submission. But as long as you're meeting prevailing wage at the end of the day, you won't really receive any negative impacts as long as you're doing it voluntarily. And then closing out a project, and I realize I'm at about 4:50. I've only got a couple slides left. So we're close, and then love questions. But closing out a project, there are steps you have to do. So people are off the site. Now the administrative burden comes back again. You need to make sure all of your certified payroll is submitted in all the places it has to be submitted. Make sure you've included no work weeks, and then make sure you're checking your last week of payroll as final. You have to do that in order for it to stop requesting it, basically, and you're not considered late and your pay is withheld. And then you need to work with either the agency or the prime contractor on closeout process. So they're going to circle back and, maybe request documentation. Make sure you're getting them everything they need as quickly as you can so they can get you closed out. And if they need to pay retainage, then that gets released. And then lastly, once everything's sorted out, file your affidavit of wages paid with L&I. So after all certified payroll is done, you have to go back in and file that document. And it has to be an accurate representation of what was on certified payroll. And then there's a notice of completion that gets filed. Usually that's done by the owner or agency. You might be asked for some information regarding that. A lot of times when the state is looking at the NOC, so the notice of completion, they might come back and say, hey, we need additional scope information on what contractor X did. We don't think they used the right classification. So even though you think a project might be long done and gone, if L&I is reviewing that notice of completion and they think something's suspect, it will come back and you'll have to provide information. So having everything done ahead of time, all your documentation, makes sure that in the event of an audit, you're ready to go. So responsible contracting as a whole, why is it so important to understand prevailing wage and meet these requirements? And the reason is repercussions. So there can be pay holds by the agency or prime contractor. So if you're late submitting your payroll or you haven't filed your intent yet, they can hold your pay. And they have every right to until you are in compliance. So it's best not to go that route. Everyone likes to be paid. There's also fines and penalties that can be issued by the Department of Labor or L&I, depending on the project. No one likes fines. Worse than that, you can be issued a strike or be debarred. So strikes, like you get 3 strikes and then you're out. So you don't want to be on that list. But if you get debarred, and that's usually you're a repeat offender or you've done something so egregious and malicious that they deem you not worthy of performing work on public works projects, and you cannot even compete in this space until they release you from that. So that's pretty severe repercussions. But for most small contractors, the biggest thing is damage to your reputation. Prime contractors keep track of people that are difficult to work with, that never get their paperwork on time, and they won't actually even entertain your bid in the future because they know that you're not going to meet all these requirements. So by getting everything done, understanding it, making sure you're easy to work with, that's going to be a boon to you in getting repeat work. Quick note on responsible subcontracting. If you need to hire subcontractors, everything that you're having to do, consider with them. Make sure they have all the appropriate licensing paperwork, that they haven't been disqualified from bidding. Do your due diligence and make sure who you're working with is going to be a good choice for you, because that reflects on you also as a contractor. So tips for success: read the contract and ask for clarification as needed. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Make sure you're educating yourself on prevailing wage requirements. Know what you need to know. And if you don't know, ask people. Just don't ignore it until it's too late. Involve all stakeholders within your company. Involve your administrative team. They need to know these things as well. And evaluate your capacity to handle both the technical and the administrative requirements. Both need to be factored in. Can't emphasize communication enough. And then utilize your resources and ask questions of those people. So your resources, Washington L&I, the Department of Labor, they're not as scary as you think. They're actually really great people and they can answer a lot of questions. Any prevailing wage experts. So there's people out there that can be experts for a project, your administrator. There's experts in the form of consultants. So that's me, that's what I do. Agencies, prime contractors, they have knowledge. They have people who can help. Your certified payroll systems and customer support for those systems are great resources. Apex is an amazing resource. They have people, they can put you in touch with the right people. So there's all these ways you can be successful on these projects. You just have to be aware of them and then utilize them to your advantage. And so with that, I'm done. I didn't leave a ton of time for questions, but I made it by 5. I know it's a lot. There's a lot of information in a short period of time. So I appreciate you all sticking with it.
All right, Wendy, thank you so very much. I am going to close out our session, and I want to thank everybody for being here. Please stick around for the Q&A. And if you're not sticking around, have a great night.